From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
When Labour came to power last summer, one of the very first things Wes Streeting did on his first day in the Department of Health was call the BMA and say, come in to chat with me, we need to end these strikes.
At the time, the NHS had already faced 2 years of paralysing strikes. So the Times health editor, Eleanor Hayward, was fascinated by the emerging relationship between the new health secretary, Wes Streeting, and the doctors at the British Medical Association.
Wes Streeting offered them a 22% pay rise, and I think everyone thought, great, that's the end of the matter. We can move on and recover the NHS now. And the BMA have obviously said no.
It's not enough.
Yeah, they want more.
That dispute has led to the impending strikes starting on Friday, when 50,000 doctors are expected to walk out for 5 days. But while Wes Streeting is locking horns with the BMA, his own party is introducing big changes that might make strikes like these a regular feature.
We are on the verge of historic legislation to make work more secure, ensure rights are enforced and trade unions are strengthened.
Why is the Cabinet at loggerheads over strikes? And with public support plummeting, do the doctors still have a cause? Or is this strike a step too far? The story today: why are the doctors going on strike?
My name's Eleanor Hayward and I'm the health editor at The Times.
Eleanor, talk us through all the latest we now know on the strike that's due to go ahead as things stand on Friday.
Yeah, so on Friday at 7 a.m, about 50,000 doctors are expected to walk out of hospitals around England. Now, this strike would be disastrous, really, for the NHS and for the government, who have made fixing the NHS their key priority. And so this week we're seeing some last-minute talks between Wes Streeting, the health secretary, and the leaders of the British Medical Association to try and get the strikes called off and to reach a deal.
I just think the BMA's approach to this from start to finish has been completely wrong. And instead of working in partnership, they've chosen confrontation.
That's why the resident doctors have voted to strike again, because they're not getting that movement that they need to see from the Secretary of State.
It's going down to the wire, really. The BMA have said there's a window of opportunity to avert the strikes, and Wes Streeting and his team are really, really keen to try and find a way forward. But at the moment, it just seems like the sides are too far apart, because on the one side, Wes Streeting is saying he's refusing to budge on pay. Pay is the one thing he will not negotiate on. And then on the other side, the BMA are saying the only thing we will take is more pay to call off strikes. And so unless one of them shifts, it's very hard to see how there's going to be a way through.
How are the NHS planning for a potential strike?
So the NHS have got quite used to planning for strikes, because if you remember then in 2023 and 2024, we had wave after wave of strikes from doctors, nurses, paramedics.
We're on strike today outside St Thomas's Hospital.
We're just really not valued for the work that we do. It's been 20 months without any sort of credible pay offer.
So in a way, they've got a playbook for how to handle them. But this year, things are going slightly differently, because the new NHS Chief Executive, Sir Jim Mackey, has basically said that the level of harm and disruption we saw during the strikes in 2023 and 2024 is not acceptable. Junior doctors went on strike for 44 days in 2023 and 2024. And it was disastrous for patients. There was 1.5 million cancellations. And obviously for some of those patients that then leads to harm down the line. It might be a delayed cancer diagnosis. It might be a delayed operation that means they have months more in pain. Several deaths have been linked to these strikes, to patients just not being able to get care on hospital wards because there weren't enough doctors. And Mackie's taking a different stance and has written to all NHS hospital bosses and said, this time you cannot cancel as many operations and you need to keep as much care going as possible and only cancel operations if there really is no doctors available to do it. Whereas during previous strikes, it was what's called a Christmas Day level of service, which is when basically the A&E keeps running and any really urgent critical care keeps running, but all other routine care is called off.
I mean, that's quite a brave move by the new chief executive of the NHS. If they're not cancelling appointments and the strike doesn't get cancelled, what happens?
Well, that's the big question going into the weekend. The British Medical Association have made quite an extraordinary statement. They wrote to Mackie, who's the NHS chief executive, and accused him of putting patients at risk, even though the BMA are the ones going out on strike. The BMA have said that unless the NHS change their policy and do cancel all planned care, then there's not going to be enough doctors in hospitals working over the weekend.
Yeah.
And then patients on all wards, including A&E, including planned care, are going to be at risk.
We've had proven systems over the last decade that have ensured that where we have to take strike action, there is capacity from senior doctors to cover urgent, emergency and critical care. This time round, NHS England are pushing for the continuation of non-urgent and scheduled care in a way that we think is at best confusing and will create more on-the-day cancellations, and at worst could be risky and lead to harm in emergency departments and on wards because senior doctors cannot physically be in two places at once.
Do we have a sense of how many operations might be affected by this?
It's definitely going to be in the tens of thousands. The NHS Confederation, which represents hospitals, has said they think about 100,000 appointments will be impacted.
Wow. What's the BMA, the British Medical Association, what's their argument for why they think these strikes have to go ahead?
The British Medical Association are set on getting something called full pay restoration. Now, doctors' pay has, compared to real terms levels, it's fallen gradually since 2008. And the BMA say that to restore it to 2008 levels, they need a 29% pay rise for resident doctors. Resident doctors is the new term for junior doctors. They were renamed last year by the BMA and the NHS.
And just give us a sense of sort of what phase in doctoring is that? How long are you a junior or a resident doctor?
Resident doctors actually covers quite a long time span and quite a few different levels of experience. So someone fresh out of medical school is a first-year resident doctor, but then they can have been working in the NHS for up to a decade, getting more experience, doing more speciality training for things like surgery or oncology.
I mean, it's a significant phase if it's covering a decade of experience. And this whole cohort feel that they are underpaid.
Yes, they feel that compared to jobs which require a similar level of pressure and expertise, they say they're not paid enough. Resident doctors who are fresh out of medical school start with a basic salary of £38,831. That can rise to £73,992 for those in their last year of training. Now, on top of these basic salaries, it's important to note that doctors will get their income boosted because you get extras for things like working weekends, working on call, which all doctors have to do. The British Medical Association say that their pay has fallen by 21% since 2008 when factoring in inflation. Now, things get slightly complicated here. There's two different measures of inflation. There's one called Retail Price Index, RPI, and Consumer Price Index, CPI.
What's the difference between the two?
It's quite complicated and I'm not that good at economics, but the Retail Price Index factors in things like student loans and mortgages, housing costs. And the CPI, I think, is more retail goods. Importantly, the CPI is the measure of inflation favoured by statisticians and by the government and is seen as a much more reliable measure of inflation.
Right. So the CPI takes a basket of goods that you would go into a shop and buy and looks at how much prices have changed in that time. Whereas the RPI is also looking at how much more you'll be paying for housing and all the things that sort of affect your life, like council tax.
Yeah, which is why the BMA say it's the right measure for them to use, because they point out that obviously doctors are affected by housing and things like train fares, which RPI is based on, and also student loans is a huge thing for doctors. They graduate with £100,000 of student debt now. So the student loan rate is obviously important. So they say that pay has fallen by 21% since 2008 based on RPI.
Which is hugely significant. That's a fifth.
Yeah, that's a fifth. And to restore that, you then need a 29% pay increase. If you use CPI, then pay has still fallen, but only by 4.7% since 2008. So it's much less significant. One of the reasons that Wes Streeting is so reluctant and is ruling out moving on pay is because resident doctors have received the biggest pay rise in the public sector for the past 2 years. And so they got an extra 5.4% this year on top of the 22% last year. And when you compare that to nurses who got a 3% rise this year, ministers really fear that if they were to give doctors more money to end this strike, there'd be a domino effect. And then you'd have the rest of the public sector, including nurses, teachers, train drivers, saying, OK, well, strikes clearly work. We'll go on strike and get a pay rise as well. Nurses are furious. They're furious. They said that it was grotesque. That was the language used by the Royal College of Nurses, that doctors got such a big pay rise when nurses didn't. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw nurses out on strike later this year as well. I think one thing that is an important distinction is that while resident doctors maybe aren't paid a huge amount in their early years, almost all do go on to become consultants in the NHS. And if you're an NHS consultant, they earn about £145,000 on average each year, which is in the top 1% of salaries in the UK. Whereas nurses, they never have that option. I mean, the most well-paid nurses in the NHS will still only be on about £50,000. There's quite a big difference there in terms of future financial security from doctors versus nurses.
So, Eleanor, you look at this all the time. What do you think? Are resident doctors actually underpaid? Do they have a valid case?
I think it's tricky because the career progression element and the fact that doctors do go on to earn upwards of £100,000 as standard if they complete their specialty training means it can be hard to have sympathy, because that's a very well-paid job that I think most of us would, love to have. But then also, these are some of the brightest minds in the country. They're treated quite appallingly by their employer, and we put our lives in their hands. I mean, if you're admitted to a hospital in an emergency, you might have someone saving your life who's earning £40,000 when, you'd pay anything for that. And if it was your family member. But I think I can see why it does seem unaffordable for the government to increase their pay, and why they've had a 22% pay rise last year. It seems unreasonable to call strikes straight away when you don't get that again.
So clearly they feel that they're not being paid anywhere near what many of them might have been expecting when they were first deciding to become doctors before they started training. Just give us a sense of what are the working conditions for this cohort?
It definitely is about more than just pay. I think anyone you talk to in the NHS, senior figures, will acknowledge that resident doctors are often treated appallingly by their employers, the hospitals. I mean, doctors who are doing their training often don't really have much say in where they're put around the country, and they might only be given their placement. It might be at the other end of the country a few weeks before they have to start. It's also hard shifts. It's weekends, night shifts, Christmas Day. Long shifts. They have to sacrifice a lot compared to other people in their 20s who might be on 9 till 5 grad schemes. And if you're, just out of uni and you've got your friends going out, and you have to accept that there'll be several years where you can't have that quality of life. There's also things like lack of free hospital parking, lack of a warm meal on shifts, lack of a bed to sleep in on night shifts. These kind of quite basic things that you'd expect if you're working hard hours in a hospital, helping people stay alive, that these doctors just aren't getting. And everyone, I think, including West Streeting, is willing to acknowledge that that needs to be changed.
That really is tough. And we are seeing a lot of doctors leaving, going to countries like Australia. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, a lot of doctors are leaving the NHS, and there's two key reasons for that, really. One is the pay and the lifestyle is much better often in places like Australia and New Zealand. Some of them can double their basic salaries and also have more days off, better quality of life. There's also this real issue at the moment where there's not enough training spaces in the NHS for resident doctors. So doctors complete their first 2 years of training and then they have to apply for a specialty training post in something like surgery, psychiatry, in a specialism. The NHS doesn't have enough of those posts for the number of resident doctors. So actually, thousands of doctors working in the UK in the NHS are now unemployed and just can't find a job in the UK.
That does sound preposterous at a time when it feels like we don't have enough doctors. Clearly something is going wrong. There are lots of systemic problems, which is partly why we're now facing a strike at the end of the week. What's the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, saying and doing about all of this? Do you know what he's offering?
I have no idea what he's offering. The talks are top secret. We know the areas that are being discussed. One of them is pensions. Doctors have very generous pensions. There's this possibility that maybe some of the money that's put into their pensions could instead be given to them as take-home pay. There's also other issues. There's student debt. Like we said, doctors graduate with £100,000 of student debt these days. Could some of that be written off by the government if they stay working in the NHS? Then things like training posts, career progression, working conditions. I think any pledges from government to really improve that could form part of a deal.
So there is ground there that they might be able to agree on.
Yeah, there's definitely common things that both sides want to improve, but it's still hard to see how that would be enough to call off the strikes without pay as well.
Eleanor, you were explaining how Wes Streeting, who feels he can't really shift on pay, is, trying to use other creative policy areas to try and get an agreement, but it doesn't look likely at the moment. It does sometimes feel like his efforts to call off the strike are slightly being frustrated by his colleague in Cabinet, Angela Rayner's efforts to support the Employment Rights Bill. Talk us through that. What is this piece of legislation and how will it affect situations like this?
Yeah, this is a very interesting backstory to the junior doctors' strike. Angela Rayner one of her landmark pieces of legislation is a new Employment Rights Bill, which essentially aims to give unions more power and make it easier for unions to call strikes. Now, obviously, if you're Wes Streeting, that's the last thing you want because he's in battle with the BMA and other health unions, and he can't afford for there to be more strikes if NHS waiting lists are to fall. The Employment Rights Bill, which is currently making its way through the House of Lords, will make it much easier for unions like the BMA to strike in future. One of the key things it's doing is getting rid of a current legal requirement that for a union to go on strike, turnout in the strike ballot has to be 50%.
Right, so at least half of your members need to have voted.
Yeah. Now, this is especially relevant to the BMA because turnout in the BMA's ballot has been falling and was only 55% in the most recent one. And so it could really happen that next year, when the BMA's current mandate runs out, they reballot and they don't meet the 50% strike threshold, which for Wes Streeting would be fantastic news. It would bring the dispute to the end. However, Angela Rayner's bill...
if the bill has passed in Parliament by then, it could be a very different picture.
Yeah, doctors would be able to strike anyway, almost indefinitely. And at the same time, you've got the BMA saying they're not going to back down, they're going to keep striking for as long as it takes. So this lever that Wes Streeting had of maybe the turnout won't reach 50% is no longer going to be available to him. I think it's very interesting as well because when you talk about the future leaders of the Labour Party, it's almost seen as a two-horse race between Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting. And Wes Streeting can't appear to be anti-union if he's going to get the backing of Labour members. So I think it would be tricky for him to actually say, well, this employment rights bill is really scuppering my efforts to reform the NHS.
So it's turning into a real problem for Wes Streeting. What else will this bill change if it goes through?
There's two key things that will be a problem. The first is that the mandate unions have to call strike action after the ballot has passed will be extended from 6 months to 12 months. So currently the ballot the BMA have is due to run out in January. Under this new legislation, it wouldn't run out until July next year. So it's basically an extra 6 months of strikes and all the disruption that comes with that. It's also giving the unions a bit more power in that they'll no longer have to inform hospitals about how many people are walking out and where they work. So hospitals will be a bit more in the dark about how many doctors are going on strike and where they need to find cover. I think people are just starting to realise that this employment rights bill will be a big issue. I was chatting to Richard Sloggett, who is now a health consultant. He was a former SPAD to Matt Hancock when Matt Hancock was health secretary. And he just, said the government's got itself in a real mess here because it's got Angela Rayner basically undermining what Wes Streeting's trying to do, which is ensure that the BMA can't keep going out on strikes. He's warned that we could have indefinite NHS strikes because there's always going to be members of the BMA, members of the Royal College of Nursing who are unhappy about the way they are treated. And with the new legislation from Angela Rayner, then there's no levers really for the government to prevent them from striking.
And if, as you say, the BMA strikes then encourage nurses to go out because they've had even less in terms of a pay rise and other people working across the sector, this could cost the NHS a lot of money. How much does that set back the Labour government's 10-year plan for the NHS, which seems to be the centrepiece of their administration at the moment?
Yeah, so Keir Starmer has essentially bet the Labour Party's political fortunes on turning the NHS around before the next election. We've seen that in things like the spending review, where all other public sector and public services got massively squeezed, whereas the NHS got a £30 billion boost. And there's also the government's 10-year plan, which they've made the centrepiece of their sort of vision for the future of the country, which is all about transforming the NHS and ensuring that by the next election in 2029, 90% of patients are seen within 18 weeks. Currently, only about 60% are seen within 18 weeks. So it's a huge amount of change. And then that will require getting NHS waiting lists down from their current figure, which is about 7.4 million, down to 4 million. So a huge, huge task and challenge ahead. Doctors' strikes, if they're prolonged, will make that impossible. And, you can then from that say, well, if the NHS waiting lists aren't going to fall, then Labour don't stand a chance at the next election because that was their key pledge. So it's really, really huge stakes ahead for Streeting in trying to get the BMA to call off their strikes.
Where are the public on this? Do we know whether there's public support for these strikes?
Public support for the strikes has essentially collapsed over the past year. When doctors went on strike last summer, just before the general election, more than half of Britons supported them. Now we did some polling for the Times last week, and it was by YouGov, and that found that only 36% of the public support junior doctors. And another poll due out this week actually shows that that's fallen even further.
Really?
And so Streeting has really sought to play this up, and he's told junior doctors they don't have the public support anymore, and going on strike when people don't support you is a very different prospect to the last round of strikes under the Conservative government when they did have majority support. And I think you remember the picket lines outside hospitals, there'd be cars tooting their horns in support, there'd be people really cheering them on. And I think the public mood's shifted very significantly since then.
And what about within the medical community itself? Because we've had a few high-profile scientists and doctors who don't seem happy about this.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I think during previous strikes then, a lot of senior doctors maybe had their reservations about it and were concerned about the impact on patients, but they were reluctant to say that out loud. And And what we've seen this time round is quite a lot of senior figures in the medical profession coming out and really urging the BMA to think carefully. That includes Professor Robert Winston, who's a very well-known scientist who's often on TV shows. And he quit the BMA after 60 years after they called these strikes, saying they were just too dangerous and he couldn't support them anymore.
Thoroughly damaging. It's damaging to the doctors, it's damaging to the profession. Most importantly, it's damaging to patients, and the risk of taking one's work out means inevitably that at least somebody will die, even if it's only a matter of 1 or 2 days after the strike has started.
Also, Lord Aradazi, who led a landmark report into the NHS last year, he said the strikes are unjustifiable, and he warned that the public's trust in doctors might not actually recover from this.
I mean, that is a very serious threat. Do you think it'll make any difference at the BMA? Do you think there is a chance they might call off the strikes, having heard criticisms like that?
I don't think so. I think they went into this battle prepared to not necessarily have the public on side. During the last strikes, they also faced a lot of criticism and it didn't put them off. And they're so committed to this pay claim that I can't see it making much difference.
Eleanor, if this strike does go ahead on Friday, as somebody who watches this all the time and who's looked at the strikes last time round too, what would your advice be for patients who think they're supposed to be going into hospital this Friday for surgery?
I think you've got to do what the NHS is saying, which is, unless you've been contacted and told that your appointment's cancelled, carry on as normal. I think, even though we know hospitals are trying to run more than they were last time, they're still not going to do anything that would be dangerous and would put patients at risk. So I think go ahead as normal. If you're unwell, go to A&E as normal and kind of put the trust in those staff who are still working to make sure that you're safe and looked after. And the hospital consultants are being drafted in to provide cover, and that means there will be a lot of doctors still working.
That was Eleanor Hayward, the health editor at The Times, and you can read more of her work, including all the latest on the strikes, at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Hannah Varrall. The executive producer was Taryn Siegel, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.